Sandra Manoj, third year English, Pioneer College. Readings on Democracy and Secularism. Chapter Blackout, Roger Mace. The city was in partial blackout. The street lights had not been turned on account of the wartime policy of conserving electricity, and the houses behind their discreet Aurelia hedges were wrapped in an atmosphere of exclusive respectability. The young woman waiting at the bus stop was not in the least nervous in spite of the wave of panic that had been sweeping the city about bands of hooligans roaming the streets after dark and assaulting unprotected women. She was a sensible young woman to begin with, who realized that one good scream would be sufficient to bring a score of respectable suburban householders running to her assistance. On the other hand, she was an American and fully conscious of the tradition of American young women that they don't scare easily. Even that slinking black shadow that seemed to be slowly materializing out of the darkness at the other side of the street did not disconcert her. She was only slightly curious now that she observed that the shadow was approaching her. It was a young man dressed in conventional shirt and pants, with a pair of canvas shoes on his feet. That was what lent the suggestion of slinking to his movements, because he went along noiselessly and that mere suggestion of a stoop. He was very tall, and there was a curious look as of a great hunger or unrest about the eyes. But the thing that struck her immediately was the fact that he was black. The other particulars scarcely made any impression at all in comparison. In her country, not every night a white woman could be nonchalantly approached by a black man. There was enough of novelty in all this to intrigue her. She seemed to remember that any sort of adventure might be experienced in one of these tropical islands of West Indies. "Could you give me a light, lady?" the man said. It is true that she was smoking, but she had only just lit this one from the stub of the cigarette she had thrown away. The fact was she had no matches. Would he believe her? She wondered. "I'm sorry, I haven't got a match." The young man looked into her face, seemed to hesitate an instant and said, his brow slightly wrinkled in perplexity, "But you are smoking." There was no argument against that. Still, she was not particular about giving him a light from the cigarette she was smoking. It may be stupid, but there was a suggestion of intimacy about such an act. Simple as it was, that, call it what you may, she just could not accept just like that. There was a moment's hesitation on her part now, during which time the man's steady gaze never left her face. There was pride and challenge in his look, curiously mingled with that something of quiet amusement. She held out her cigarette towards him between two fingers. "Here," she said, "you can light from that." In the act of bending his head to accept the proffered light, he had perforce to come quite close to her. He did not seem to understand that she meant him to take the lighted cigarette from her hand. He just went over her hand to lit his. Presently he straightened up, inhaled a deep lungful of soothing smoke, and exhaled again with satisfaction. She saw that he was smoking the half of a cigarette that had been clinched and saved for future consumption. "Thank you," said the man politely, and was in the act of moving on when he noticed that instead of returning her cigarette to her lips, she had casually, unthinkingly flicked it away. He observed all this in the split part of a second that it took him to say those two words. It was almost a whole cigarette she had thrown away. She had been smoking it with evident enjoyment a moment before. He stood her looking at her with cold speculation. In a way, it unnerved her. Not that she was frightened. He seemed quite decent in his own way and harmless, but he made her feel uncomfortable. If he had said something rude, she would have preferred it. It would have been no more than she would have expected of him. But instead, this quite contemptuous look, yes, that was it. The thing began to take on definition on her mind. How dare he? The insolence! "Well, what are you waiting for?" she said, because she felt she had to break the tension somehow. "I'm sorry, I made you waste a whole cigarette," he said. She laughed a little nervously. It's nothing, she said, feeling a fool. There's plenty more than where it came from, huh? He asked. I suppose so. This won't do, she thought quickly. She had no intention of standing at a street corner jawing with a black man. There was something indecent about it. Why doesn't he move on? As though he had read her thoughts, he said, This is a street, lady. It's public. Well, she didn't have to answer him. She could snub him quietly, the way she should have properly done from the start. It's a good thing you are a woman, he said. And if I were a man? As man to man, maybe, I would give you something to think about, he said, still in that quiet, even voice. In America, they lynched them for less than that, she thought. This isn't America, he said. I can see you are an American. In this country, there are only men and women. You'll learn about that if you stop here long enough. That was too much. But there was nothing she could do about it. But yeah, there was. She could humor him, find out what his ideas were about these questions anyway. It would be something to talk about back home. Suddenly she was intrigued. So, in this country there are only men and women, huh? That's right. So to speak, there is only you and me. Only there are hundreds of thousands of us. We seem to get along somehow without lynchings and burnings and all that. Do you really think that all men are created equal? It doesn't seem to me there is any sense in that. The facts show it ain't so. Look at you and me, for instance. But that isn't to say you are not a woman the same way as I am a man. You see what I mean? I can't say I do. You will though, if you stop here long enough. She threw a quick glance in his direction. The man laughed. I don't mean what you are thinking, he said. You are not my type of woman. You don't have anything to fear under that heading. Oh, you're waiting for the bus? I take it. Well, that's it, coming now. Thanks for the light. Don't mention it, she said with a nervous sort of giggle. He made no attempt to move along as the bus came up. He stood there quietly aloof, as though in the consciousness of a male strength and pride that was justly his. There was something about him that was at once challenging and disturbing. He had shaken her supreme confidence in some important sense. As the bus moved off, she was conscious of his eyes, quietly scrutiny of her, without the interruption of artificial barriers, in the sense of dispassionate appraisement, as between man and woman, any man, any woman. She fought resolutely against the very natural desire to turn her head and take a last look at him. Perhaps she was thinking about what the people on the bus might think, and perhaps it was just as well that she did not see him bent forward with that swift, hungry movement, retrieving from the gutter the half-smoked cigarette she had thrown away. Glossary: Blackout, a period during which all lights are switched off, power cut. Discreet, respecting privacy, maybe keeping the houses partly hidden from public view. Aurelia hedges, a row of closely spaced bush or trees of the kind. Atmosphere, exclusive respectability, a residential area that commands respect. Suburban householders, residents of the outskirts of the town. Bands of hooligans, criminal or anti-social gangs. Slinking, move in a stealthy and sensual manner. Proffered, held out. Clinch, get or win something. Flick, make a quick movement with fingers to propel something. Join, talking at length with unease. Lynching, here it refers to the practice in the US of extrajudicial killing of blacks by hanging publicly as a spectacle. Jim Crow South. Dispassionate appraisement, objective assessment. About the writer and the short story, Roger Mace, 1905 to 1955, was born in Jamaica. He was a journalist, novelist, poet, short story writer and playwright. Mace is known for his books Brother Man, Listen, The Wind, Black Lighting, and The Hills Were Joyful Together. He is the author of more than 30 stage and radio plays and 100 plus short stories. For a short spell, he was in the UK. He was a politically active person using a variety of cultural artifacts for questioning inequality, social injustice, and colonialism. On this ground, his works have been described as propaganda. As a public intellectual involved in the independence movement, Roger Mace condemned England for the colonial exploitations and subjugation and accused Winston Churchill of hypocrisy and deception. The colonial regime charged him of sedition and sentenced him for 6 months. As a major figure of Jamaican cultural nationalism, Mace advocated social and political change. His characters spoke local West Indian dialect. Mace was awarded the Order of Jamaica for his integral role in the development of political and cultural nationalism. Blackout is the story of an encounter between a black young man and a white American woman in the backdrop of racial tension and a blackout. The poem on radical historicizing reveals a cluster of binaries and their subsidiaries animating the encounter. White, black, man, women, masculine, feminine, rich, poor, American, Jamaican, colonial, national are some of them. The woman was waiting at the bus stop with a baggage of ideologies and a consequent worldview during the blackout in the city. The young man, with another cultural baggage and worldview, approached her for lighting his clinched half cigarette. She had no light but just a lit cigarette. She was also not very particular about sharing the light and faced him with a condescending silence. After a moment's hesitation, she held out the cigarette for him to take it and light. He missed the message and lit it bending over her hand. She was confused by the intimacy of that action and she flicked that whole cigarette away unthinkingly. This gave a crucial turn to the whole situation and the provoked young man studied her in cold speculation. This made her nervous, though he was not rude, she expected him to be. She asked him what makes him stay on there and he reminded her that it was a street, a public one. The dominant masculine takes over the young man and he said he would give her something to remember if she were a man. He was sure she would learn it if she remained there long enough. This, she thought, was an insolence for which he would be lynched in America. He anticipates her thought and reminds her that they are not in America, but in a country where there are only men and women. His idea of humanity is fine, but gendered. She decides to humor him to talk more about it, to get something to talk about back home. He proceeds with the comment that humanity of their land is nothing but versions of them too, and they get along somehow without lynching. It is important to note that the encounter opens up certain deep questions about the two cultures, the black and the white, the colonizing and the colonized, the lynching and the accommodating, the one that throws away a cigarette to spite the black and the urban poor who patiently waits to clinch a whole cigarette without offending his masculinity. Mace is telling the world to look for power dynamics of race and gender in the everyday lives of people, even in casual moments. Answer in 2 or 3 sentences each. 1. What is the context of the partial blackout? 2. Is the young woman's confidence purely personal? If not, how can it be explained? 3. Is the encounter purely something between two persons? If not, why? 4. What does Mace suggest about black man and the women by a mention of black man's eyes? 5. Given the circumstances in the story and the blackout, is the women's behavior odd? Justify your answer. 6. Mace gives a graphic description of the setting. Does it suggest something about one of the motives of the story? 7. Why was the experience novel to her? What does it tell about her life and community back home? 8. What would have happened if such a scene takes place in the American South? 9. The text says the young women expected any sort of adventure in one of these tropical islands of the West Indies. What ideological baggage does she carry with her? 10. The black man seemed quite decent in his own way and harmless, but still he made her feel uncomfortable. What is the source of her unease? 11. The half cigarette that had been clenched and saved for future consumption. Does it signify something about the social class? 12. Was she serious in her conversation about equality of men and women? How do you know? 13. What question did the women ask when lynching was mentioned? Can we infer her attitude to lynching? Answer in 80 to 100 words. 1. Look at the way the young black man's entry into the story is described as perceived by the white women at the bus stop. That slinking black shadow that seemed to be slowly materializing out of the darkness. Does the beginning have the suggestion of something uncanny? What is the purpose of that? Respond to the description, studying the connotations of the words black, shadow, slinking, and materialize. 2. The history of lynching in America. The lynchers claimed falsely was to protect white women. What meanings do the two characters make of each other? What ideologies do they employ to make such meanings? What would happen if it was in a racist country? Based on the premise and also keeping the questions given in view, elaborate how even very casual instances like asking for a light in Blackout can take tragic turns. 3. Discuss how the setting of the story helps the author to work out the preconceptions of the two characters and conclude their encounter raising very serious questions like perception on the basis of rigid binaries and consequent violence. 4. How does the writer build up the suspense in the story? Does he succeed in making the reader also suspect the black man as the woman does? 5. The story has a third-person, unnamed narrator. Explore to what extent he succeeds to foregrounding the black question without stereotyping the white women. Answering 200 to 250 words. First one, elaborate. Mace has structured the plot around a casual incident of lighting a cigarette to explore the internalized racial and gender binaries operating in the everyday lives of people. 2. Is it possible to argue that Roger Mais strategically concludes that black men very narrowly escape being lynched when white racism distorts everyday human transactions in most cases? 3. Roger Mace's writings have been sometimes described as propaganda, but this story disproves their observation. Respond. 4. Discuss the function of cigarette as an objective correlative. Read, relate, and write. 1. Maya Angelou in her biography narrates how a white racist dentist refused to treat her just because she was black. Kamala Das was denied an opportunity to read her poem because she was brown and an Indian. Write an essay on systemic racism after reading the articles mentioned above. 2. At one point in the story, the man told the woman that if she were a man, he would give her something to think about. Then she thinks that saying this much is enough for a person to be lynched in America. Read the articles and write an essay on the history of lynching in American online. 3. Collect news items on similar lynching in Kerala and write an article on why lynching becomes so frequent in Kerala. 4. Adapt the history of encounter between black man and white American lady into a screenplay. Read this first. Drama and short stories share certain features. Both have plot and tell a story. Another common element is of character. A conflict and its resolution are also shared features. Another similarity is the use of dialogue and conversation. Short story use dialogue moderately while it is a prominent element of drama. 5. The woman in the Mace story is worried about joining with a stranger and does not look back while boarding the bus, though she felt like looking at him. Her behavior verges upon xenophobia, something that is a socially given. Discuss these two actions on her part in the context of societal restrictions on women and the patriarchal ideology internalized by her. Language matters. The Roger Mace short story can be taken as a cross between short story and a short play, especially down the middle of it. Write a note on the language strategies, use of grammatical categories, and device employed by the writer to make it dramatic within the form of the short story. 2. Study the words used for being polite and the use of contractions. Do they add to the effect of visualization of the scene? In what ways? Thank you.